The snow started falling on a Thursday, which I remember because Thursday was the day I used to pick up my granddaughter from school. I hadn't done that in 7 months, not since my son-in-law made it clear that my presence at their house was, in his words, disrupting the routine. I sat at my kitchen table that morning with my coffee going cold and a letter in my hand I'd already read 4 times. It was from my daughter. Not a text, not a call, a letter. 3 paragraphs explaining why it would be better for everyone if I didn't come to Thanksgiving this year. Better for everyone. I'm 63 years old. I spent 22 years as a homicide investigator for the Chicago Police Department. I've interviewed killers who looked me in the eye and lied with less rehearsal than that letter contained. I set the letter down and looked out the window at the snow. My name is not important. What matters is that I raised my daughter alone after her mother passed. Breast cancer, 2003. When my daughter was 11 years old, I worked doubles. I made her lunches. I drove her to dance recitals in a squad car one time because I had no other option. We were not a perfect family, but we were ours. She met my son-in-law at a conference in Phoenix 6 years ago. He works in commercial real estate. He's 41, which is 9 years younger than her, and he has the kind of confidence that men develop when everything has come easily to them. The first time I shook his hand, he gripped too hard and held a second too long, a small thing. But I noticed. My daughter called him ambitious. I called him something else. Privately, in my own head. They married 2 years later. A destination wedding in Sedona that I paid a significant portion of because my daughter asked me to, and I would have handed her the moon if she'd asked for that instead. My son-in-law accepted the money without a thank you. Not delayed gratitude, not mentioned at dinner, nothing. My daughter explained he was overwhelmed with logistics. I let it go. That was my first mistake. I let a lot of things go in those early years. He called me Chief as a nickname, which sounds respectful until you realize he said it the way some people say sport to a child they don't take seriously. He interrupted me at dinner. He redirected conversations when I was speaking. He made small comments about my house, the neighborhood, the age of my car, the fact that I still used a paper calendar on my refrigerator. None of it was enough to confront directly. That's the thing about men like him. They operate in the gap between what you can prove and what you can feel. My granddaughter, Lily. Wait, I need to stop myself. That's not her name. I'll call her by something else here because she's 6 years old and doesn't deserve to be in any story that involves what her father did. I'll call her my girl. She has her mother's eyes and she asks me questions about everything. Why the sky changes color. Why worms come out after rain. Why grandpa always smells like coffee. She is the best thing in my life. Last spring, my son-in-law decided they needed to sell their house and buy a larger property, a farmhouse on 12 acres about 40 minutes outside the city. The decision came fast, and when my daughter called to tell me, I could hear that she was reading from notes. He was in the room. I could hear him breathing. The farmhouse needed renovation, significant renovation. My son-in-law presented my daughter with a budget that required, among other things, about $80,000 from savings they didn't entirely have. My daughter called me 3 days later. She didn't ask. She circled around it for 11 minutes before I said a number myself. I said yes, because she is my daughter. I wrote the check. I signed the paperwork. I did not ask for anything in return because she is my daughter, and that is not how I love her. They moved in August. I helped with the moving boxes. My son-in-law supervised from the porch while I carried furniture with 2 of his friends who were 20 years younger than me and kept offering to take things from my hands. I declined each time. In October, he started limiting my visits. Not directly. He never does anything directly. He told my daughter that my girl needed consistency and that unexpected visits were disrupting her schedule. I had been going every Sunday since she was born. I stopped going every Sunday. Then came the letter. I read it again that Thursday morning, the snow coming down outside. My daughter's handwriting, but his words. I could tell by the sentence structure, the way certain phrases were too careful, too lawyered. It said that they were spending Thanksgiving as a family this year and that they hoped I'd understand. It said they would call to arrange a visit sometime in December. Sometime. I folded the letter. I put it in the kitchen drawer where I keep things I can't throw away yet. Then I picked up my phone and I called my oldest friend, a man I'll call Mitch, who was a prosecutor for 30 years and who I've known since we were both young and foolish. I told him what was happening, not to ask for advice, just because sometimes you need someone who knew you before life started editing you down. Mitch listened. Then he said, "You remember what you used to tell me about cases? You said never confront until you know more than they think you do." I remembered. I started paying attention. My son-in-law had a habit of posting about real estate on social media. Deals he'd closed, properties he was handling, conferences he attended. I'm not on social media myself, but my daughter's neighbor, a woman named Sandra who had known my daughter since high school, was kind enough to mention one afternoon what she'd been seeing. She'd noticed some things she thought I should know about. She wasn't gossiping. She was concerned. My son-in-law, it turned out, had been operating a side venture that was not part of his licensed business. He was directing certain clients toward a property development company, one that he had a quiet financial interest in, without disclosing that interest. In real estate, that matters. In law, that matters more. Sandra had a cousin who worked tangentially in the industry and had flagged the same company to a regulatory contact. I thanked Sandra. I went home. I made a second pot of coffee, and I sat down and I thought about what I was and was not going to do with that information. Here's what I know about revenge. Having spent 2 decades watching it, the people who plan it in anger make mistakes. The people who execute it without emotion, without noise, without anyone seeing them move, those are the ones who finish. I was not angry. I was patient. I contacted an attorney I had worked with during my career, a man of absolute discretion named Harlan who handled civil matters and new people and regulatory oversight. I did not ask him to do anything improper. I asked him to make sure the right documentation ended up in front of the right eyes. I provided what Sandra had shared with me, along with a few other items I had gathered through entirely legal means, property records, public filings, things anyone with time and experience could find if they knew where to look. Then I waited. November came. Thanksgiving came and went. I ate at Mitch's house with his family, and his wife made a pie that was better than anything I'd had in years, and I sat at that table and felt something I hadn't expected. Fine. I felt fine. Not broken. Not bitter. Fine. My daughter called on the Sunday after Thanksgiving. She sounded strained. My son-in-law, she said, was dealing with some professional stress. I told her I was sorry to hear that. I asked about my girl. She said my girl had a loose tooth and was very excited about it. I said that was wonderful. We spoke for 12 minutes. December came. The regulatory inquiry into my son-in-law's side venture came with it. These things move quietly at first. Letters, requests for documentation, attorney reviews. He would have received the first notice sometime in early December. I don't know exactly when because I was not watching. I had done what I'd done, and then I had genuinely let it go, which is its own kind of peace that I don't know how to explain except to say that once you've handed something to the current, you stop trying to swim upstream. What I did not let go was my granddaughter. 3 days before Christmas, I drove out to the farmhouse. I did not call ahead. I brought my girl a wooden puzzle I'd found at a shop in my neighborhood, the kind with pieces shaped like animals, the kind she likes. I pulled into the driveway at 10:30 in the morning. My son-in-law opened the door before I reached the porch. He looked older than the last time I'd seen him, thinner around the jaw. His eyes had the particular quality I'd seen on 100 faces over a career, the look of a man calculating, assessing, trying to determine what you know and how much you know, and whether you know it. I said good morning. I said I'd brought something for my girl. He said it wasn't a good time. I looked at him for a moment, the way I used to look at people across a table in a small room, calm, patient, not hostile, not warm. I said I didn't ask if it was a good time. He opened his mouth and then he did not say whatever he'd prepared to say. Something shifted in his face. I've seen that shift before too. It's the moment a person realizes they are not talking to who they thought they were talking to. My daughter appeared at the doorway behind him. She looked at me, then at him, then at me again. She said my name, my actual name, which she hadn't said in months, had been using Dad, with a formality that felt like distance. I held up the puzzle. My daughter stepped past her husband and held the door open. I went inside. My girl came sliding down the hallway in her socks, saw me, and made the sound that 6-year-olds make when something delights them beyond what words can handle. She grabbed my hand. She pulled me toward the living room. She showed me the small gap in her smile where the tooth had come out. She put the tooth in my palm and waited for my reaction as if she'd handed me something priceless. I told her it was the most remarkable tooth I'd ever seen. My son-in-law did not join us. I heard him on the phone in the other room, voice low, the particular muttered cadence of a man dealing with something he has not resolved and cannot stop thinking about. My daughter made coffee. We sat at the kitchen table while my girl spread out the puzzle pieces on the floor nearby. My daughter wrapped her hands around her mug and did not look at me for a long time. Then she said, "He's in trouble, isn't he?" It wasn't a question. I said, "I don't know the details of his business." She looked at me then. She is 50 years old, and I still see the 11-year-old girl sometimes. The one who sat in the front seat of my patrol car at 2 in the morning while I handled the call because I had no one to leave her with. The one who fell asleep against the door with her jacket over her like a blanket. She said, "Did you do something?" I thought about that for a moment. I thought about what doing something means. I thought about the paperwork I'd provided to Harlan and the calls I had not made but had not had to make because good information in the right hands moves by itself. I said, I made sure some people were aware of information they had a professional obligation to act on. She was quiet. I said, "He has been keeping you from me. He has been keeping my girl from me. And he has been doing things in his business that, if they go the way they're likely to go, are going to land on your doorstep whether I did anything or not." She looked at the puzzle on the floor. My girl was trying to fit two pieces together that weren't meant to go together. Patient and determined, the way children are before the world teaches them to give up. My daughter said, very quietly, "I knew." Not about the business. She meant the other thing. She meant that she knew she'd been letting it happen. The distance, the letter, the Sundays. She meant she'd been telling herself it was about routine and consistency and logistics, and she'd known the whole time that it was something else. I didn't say anything. I've learned in 63 years that some things do not need to be said aloud to be understood between two people. She reached across the table and put her hand over mine. She said, "I'm sorry, Dad." I turned my hand over and held hers. We stayed like that for a while. My son-in-law came through the kitchen once during the 2 hours I was there. He poured himself a glass of water. He did not speak to me. I did not speak to him. My daughter watched him, and he left the room. And she turned back to me with an expression I recognized from her childhood. The look of someone who has just understood the nature of a situation they had been choosing not to examine. When I left that afternoon, my girl walked me to my car. She had decided to keep one of the puzzle pieces in her pocket for luck. I told her that was an excellent plan. She hugged me around the waist, her arms not quite long enough to reach all the way. I held the back of her head. I drove home. The snow had started again, lighter this time. I put on the radio and I listened to something I didn't know the name of. Instrumental. A piano doing something slow and certain. I am not a man who gloats. I want to be clear about that. I am not writing any of this. Not telling any of this because I am proud of outmaneuvering someone. I'm telling it because of what I've learned, which is this. The people who underestimate patience are always the ones who've never needed it. My son-in-law believed he had the leverage. He had the house I'd helped pay for, the daughter I'd raised, the granddaughter who was the reason I got out of bed on the hard mornings. He believed that if he pulled those things back far enough, I would simply diminish, become smaller, become manageable, become the old man who showed up when called and left when told. He did not know who he was dealing with. Not because I'm exceptional, not because I have skills that most people don't, but because I spent 22 years learning that the truth surfaces when you give it enough time, every single time. I watched it happen in interrogation rooms, in courtrooms, in quiet conversations in hospital waiting rooms, where families finally said the things they'd been holding. The truth doesn't need you to drag it up. It only needs you to stop burying it. The regulatory inquiry progressed through the winter. I won't detail the outcome beyond saying that it was significant and professional and that it had consequences he is still managing. My daughter retained her own attorney. She is making decisions now that she is making for herself, which is all I ever wanted for her. Not that she would agree with me, but that she would think with her own mind. My Sundays came back, not all at once. These things don't come back all at once. These things don't come back all at once. But by February, I was picking up my girl every Sunday again, taking her to the same diner we've always gone to, letting her order whatever she wanted, which is always the same thing. Pancakes with the blueberry compote and a hot chocolate that she holds with both hands. One Sunday, she looked at me across the table with those eyes that are her mother's, and she said, "Grandpa, do you know any secrets?" I said, "1 or 2. She leaned forward conspiratorially. She said, "Tell me one." I thought about it. I took a sip of my coffee. Outside the diner window, the February light was doing something pale and particular across the snow. I said, "The most important secret I know is that being patient is the same thing as being strong. Most people don't know that. They think they're different." She considered this with the seriousness that 6-year-olds bring to things that interest them. Then she said, "I'm very patient." I waited a whole 7 minutes for my pancakes. I laughed. I laughed the way you laugh when something reaches the part of you that's been quiet for a long time. I paid the check. I left a good tip. We walked out into the cold and she held my hand and I drove her home, and when I pulled up to the farmhouse, my daughter was waiting on the porch with her coat on and her coffee, and she lifted her hand when she saw my car, and I lifted mine back. That was enough. That was more than enough. Some men in my position would want more. An apology delivered on their terms, a formal accounting, a moment of visible defeat. I understand that. I felt that. But what I actually wanted, the thing I'd wanted, since that first Thursday with the letter in my hand and the snow outside the window, was simply this. My daughter seeing clearly, my granddaughter knowing I would always come, and the man who thought he could dismantle that finding out, quietly, without theater, that he had been wrong. He found out. That's enough for me. I've been thinking lately about what it actually costs a person to stay quiet when everything in them wants to speak, not the silence of weakness. I want to be clear about that distinction, because I spent a long time confusing the two. When my son-in-law stood in that farmhouse doorway and told me it wasn't a good time, Part of me wanted to say every true thing I had been holding for 18 months. The part that remembered carrying furniture while he watched from the porch. The part that read my daughter's letter 3 times and recognized his sentence structure in it. That part had a great deal to say. I said none of it. And what I've come to understand is that choosing not to speak in that moment wasn't weakness. It was the most precise decision I'd made in years, because I had already done the more important thing. I had acted, quietly, through the right channels, with information I'd gathered the way I spent a career gathering information, patiently, legally, without announcing myself. There's something I want to say about cause and effect, because I think people misunderstand how it works. My son-in-law did not end up under regulatory inquiry because I was lucky, or because the universe decided to balance some cosmic ledger on my behalf. He ended up there because he had been doing something genuinely improper, steering clients toward a company he had undisclosed interest in, and because I made sure the people whose professional obligation it was to know about it actually knew. That's not mystical. That's how accountability functions when someone takes the time to understand the system instead of just raging against it. Rage would have felt better in the short term. I'm honest enough to admit that. But rage would have also made me visible. And visible is not where you want to be when you're trying to accomplish something real. My friend Mitch said something to me early on that I keep returning to. Never confront until you know more than they think you do. I spent 22 years watching what happened when investigators violated that principle, when they showed their hand too early, when they let emotion drive the timing. Cases fell apart. Guilty people walked, not because the truth wasn't there, but because the person pursuing it got impatient. I was not going to be impatient. The other thing I keep thinking about is my daughter, not what she did wrong. I've let that go, genuinely. But what it took for her to say what she said at that kitchen table. I knew. 2 words. Anyone who's ever held a truth they weren't ready to face understands what it cost to finally say it out loud. That took its own kind of courage, and I think she'd been building toward it for longer than either of us realized. What I want, if I want anything from telling this, is for someone in a similar position to understand that intelligence is not about being the loudest person in the room. It's not about winning the argument at the dinner table or having the last word at the door. It's about knowing what you know, being honest about what you don't, and then acting with enough precision that when the thing finally resolves, and it will resolve, it always does, you haven't had to sacrifice your integrity to get there. My granddaughter, sitting across from me at that diner booth with her hot chocolate, her gap-toothed smile, does not know any of this. She just knows her grandfather shows up every Sunday. That's all she needs to know right now. The rest of it, the patience, the restraint, the quiet work of making sure the right things were seen by the right eyes, that's between me and the choices I can live with. I can live with all of them.